1911, the US Navy bought a fragile kite made of wood and wire. Today, they operate floating cities armed with nuclear stealth fighters. But between the beginning and now, there were hundreds of machines. Some became legends that won wars, while others were death traps that killed their own pilots. From the biplanes launched from battleship turrets to the blimps that hunted U-boats. This is the ultimate and censored story of naval aviation. Let's start with the pioneers and the Great War, the flying bathtubs and wooden kites that invented the game. Curtiss A-1, the Triad, the Genesis. In 1911, this was the machine that started it all. Named the Triad because it was the first aircraft in the world designed to conquer three elements: land, sea, and air. With a central float for water and retractable wheels for the ground, it proved to the skeptical admirals that the sky truly belonged to the fleet. Curtiss Model F, the boat, the teacher. While the Triad was for testing, the Model F was for survival. It was essentially a flying bathtub with wings. It had no instruments, no radio, and an open cockpit that exposed pilots to the freezing wind. This is the machine that taught the first generation of naval aviators how to fly without dying. Burgess N9, the Coastal Defender, the Coastal Guard, a rugged seaplane used extensively during World War I to patrol the American coastline. It was simple, heavy, and slow, but it was the Navy's first attempt at organizing a maritime patrol force to spot enemy ships before they reached the shore. Curtiss NC-4, the Voyager, the history maker. Years before Charles Lindbergh flew solo, this massive four-engine flying boat became the first aircraft of any kind to fly across the Atlantic Ocean in 1919. It was a slow, complex web of wires and canvas, but it proved that the vast ocean was no longer a barrier to air power. Felixstowe F.5, the Spider, the U-boat Hunter, a British design built in America, this massive patrol boat was the workhorse of World War I. Its job was to fly low over the freezing North Atlantic for hours, hunting for the shadows of German submarines. It was cold, loud, and dangerous, but it established the concept of anti-submarine warfare. Aeromarine 39, the school bus, the first modern trainer. Unlike the earlier flying boats, this looked like a real airplane with landing gear. It was the primary trainer for US Navy pilots entering World War I, teaching them the basics of flight and landing on solid ground before they were deployed to Europe. Standard E-1, the early fighter, the experiment, the Navy's first attempt at a dedicated pursuit aircraft in 1917. It was flimsy, underpowered, and vibrated terribly. While it failed as a fighter, it started the lineage of naval interceptors that leads directly to the fighters of today. Next is the Golden Age and the biplanes. Yellow wings, parasitic fighters, and the birth of carriers. Vought V-7, the Bluebird, the pioneer. When the USS Langley, CV-1, America's first aircraft carrier, launched its first fighter, it was this plane. Originally designed as a trainer, it flew so well that the Navy strapped guns to it and made it their first carrier-based interceptor. Boeing F4B, the carrier-born, the classic. If you watch a movie about the Navy in the 1930s, this is the plane you see. Small, agile, and loud, it was flown by pilots in leather helmets and silk scarves. It defined the yellow wings era of open cockpit dogfighting and set the standard for carrier operations. Curtiss F-6 Seahawk, the racer. Built for speed, it was one of the first Navy planes to feature a liquid-cooled engine and a reinforced structure for vertical dive bombing. This tactic, diving straight down at a ship, would later be the key to destroying the Japanese fleet in World War II. Curtiss F-9C Sparrowhawk, the parasite, the trapeze artist, one of the most unique fighters ever built. It had no landing gear. Instead, it had a hook on top of its wing. It was launched and recovered in midair from the belly of the giant airships USS Macon and USS Akron, acting as a scout for the mothership. Grumman FF Fifi, the barrel, the first Navy fighter with landing gear that retracted into the fuselage. It looked chubby and awkward, earning the nickname Fifi, but it was faster than anything else in the fleet at the time and introduced the enclosed cockpit to naval pilots. Grumman F2F and F3F, the flying barrels, the last biplane fighters. They looked like beer kegs with wings, but they were surprisingly fast and incredibly tough. They trained the pilots who would go on to fight in World War II, bridging the gap between the old biplanes and the modern monoplanes. Great Lakes BG, the dive bomber, an early attempt at a dedicated dive bomber. It carried a heavy bomb load for a biplane and served on the early carriers like the USS Ranger. It helped refine the dangerous tactics of dive bombing that would win the Battle of Midway. F4U Corsair, the Scout. The first Corsair. Before the famous World War II fighter, this name belonged to a biplane observation aircraft. It launched from battleships and was rugged enough to be flown in the jungle wars of Nicaragua, proving aviation could support ground troops. Curtiss SBC Helldiver, the Bridge. The original Helldiver. This was the last combat biplane the Navy ever ordered. It entered service just as the world was turning to monoplanes, serving right up until the brink of World War II. It was the end of an era. Grumman J-2F Duck, the Savior. The Amphibian, a weird-looking utility plane with a massive float blended into its fuselage. It could land on runways or water, making it perfect for rescuing down pilots, hauling admirals to remote islands, and delivering urgent mail to the fleet. Grumman G-21 Goose, the Island Hopper, a twin-engine amphibian that became an icon of the Pacific. It ferried officers and supplies between islands, landing in lagoons where no runways existed. It was the Navy's taxi service in paradise. Next is the trainers and utility, the unsung heroes who built the pilots. N3N Canary, the Yellow Peril, the primary trainer. Built in the Navy's own factories, this yellow biplane was rugged and forgiving. It served as the primary trainer for thousands of pilots, staying in service throughout World War II. If you learned to fly for the Navy, you started here. Stearman N2S Cadet, the legend, the most famous biplane trainer in history. If you see a vintage biplane doing loops today, it's likely a Stearman. Rugged, simple, and acrobatic, it taught combat maneuvers to nearly every American aviator in World War II. SNJ Texan, the pilot maker, the advanced trainer. This was the last step before a pilot got into a fighter. It was fast, tricky to land, and loud. It taught pilots how to handle retractable gear, flaps, and complex engine management. Beechcraft SNB/UC-45, the Bug Smasher, the Admiral's Taxi, a twin-engine transport used to shuttle VIPs and train navigators. It was comfortable, reliable, and served for decades, earning its nickname from the amount of insects plastered on its nose after low-level flights. Next is the war in the Pacific, the legends that broke the empire. Brewster F-2A Buffalo, the failure, the tragedy, the Navy's first monoplane fighter. It was stubby and overweight. Against the agile Japanese Zero, it was a death trap. At the Battle of Midway, nearly every Buffalo launched was shot down, leading to its immediate removal from combat. F4F Wildcat, the stubborn defender, the underdog. When the war started, it was slower than the Zero, but it was built like a tank. Using the thatch weave tactic, Wildcat pilots held the line in the early dark days of the war when the Navy had nothing else. F6F Hellcat, the ace maker, the Zero killer. Grumman asked combat pilots what they wanted, and they built this. It was faster, heavily armored, and easy to fly. It destroyed over 5,000 enemy aircraft and owns the highest kill ratio, 19-1, of any naval fighter. F4U Corsair, Whistling Death, the icon, recognizable by its inverted gull wings and massive propeller. It was initially deemed too dangerous for carriers due to its bouncing landing gear, so Marines used it to terrorize Japanese ground troops from island strips. SBD Dauntless, slow but deadly, the hero of Midway. On paper, it was obsolete. In reality, it was a sniper. In one single day, squadrons of Dauntless dive bombers sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, changing the course of World War II in 5 minutes. SB-2C Helldiver, the Beast, the difficult child. Designed to replace the Dauntless, it was powerful but hated by pilots for its terrible handling and reliability issues. They joked the name SB-2C stood for Son of a Bitch, Second Class. TBD Devastator, the Sacrifice, the tragedy. Once the most advanced torpedo bomber in the world, by 1942 it was a death trap. At Midway, nearly every Devastator launched was shot down, but their sacrifice pulled the Japanese defense down to sea level, clearing the sky for the dive bombers. TBF Avenger, the Turkey, the heavy hitter, a massive torpedo bomber that looked like a flying tank, could take unbelievable punishment and still fly home. It famously carried a young George H.W. Bush, who was shot down and rescued while flying one. Brewster SB-2A Buccaneer, the Mistake, one of the worst aircraft the Navy ever bought. It was heavy, underpowered, and structurally weak. It was so bad that it was never used in combat. Instead, it was relegated to towing targets for gunnery practice. Curtiss SO-3C Seamew, the Sea Cow, a float plane designed to replace the Kingfisher, but it was a total disaster. It was so slow it couldn't outrun its own shadow and suffered from constant engine failures. The British Royal Navy called it the Sea Cow because of its sluggish performance. PBY Catalina, the Black Cat, the Eyes of the Fleet, a slow, lumbering flying boat that could stay airborne for 20 hours. It rescued thousands of downed pilots and famously spotted the Japanese fleet at Midway. PB-4Y Privateer, the Pirate, a naval version of the B-24 Liberator. Instead of high-altitude bombing, the Navy used it to roam the Pacific alone at low level, hunting Japanese shipping with a massive single tail fin and bristling with machine guns. PBM Mariner, the Big Boat, the heavy patrol bomber. Bigger and more heavily armed than the Catalina, it served as a flying destroyer, hunting submarines and transport ships throughout the war. Martin JRM Mars, the Flying Hotel, the largest flying boat ever used by the Allies. It was a true giant, capable of carrying 300 soldiers. Only a few were built, but they served for decades hauling cargo between Hawaii and California. Next is the lighter-than-air, the Silent Hunters, K-class blimp, the Gasbag, the Silent Sentinel. These massive non-rigid airships patrolled the U.S. coasts carrying radar and depth charges. They were incredibly effective at scaring away U-boats because they could hover over a convoy for days without needing to refuel. Next is the experimental transition, weird ideas and mixed engines. Ryan FR-1 Fireball, the Mutant, a strange hybrid with a propeller in the front for cruising and a jet in the back for speed bursts. It was meant to bridge the gap to the jet age, but pure jets quickly made it obsolete. North American AJ Savage, the Heavy Hybrid, a carrier-based nuclear bomber with 2 propellers and 1 jet engine buried in the tail. It was the Navy's first atomic deterrent, though it was massive and terrifyingly difficult to land on a flight deck. Grumman AF Guardian, the Hunter Killer, the Twins. This aircraft flew in pairs. One plane carried the massive radar, the Hunter, and the other carried the torpedoes, the Killer. It was an inefficient system that led to the development of single planes that could do both jobs. Martin AM Mahler Able Mabel, the single-engine beast, competed with the Sky Raider. It once carried a heavier bomb load than a 4-engine B-17, setting a world record for piston engine lift, but it was hard to fly and unreliable. Convair XFY-1 Pogo, the Sitter, a terrifying experiment. This plane took off vertically while sitting on its tail. The pilot had to look over his shoulder to land it backward, deemed too dangerous for average pilots. Convair F2Y Sea Dart, the water jet, the only supersonic seaplane ever built. It used retractable water skis to take off from the ocean. The vibration from the skis threatened to shake the aircraft apart, and the project was cancelled. Next is the jet age, missiles, Phantoms, and heavy metal. FH-1 Phantom, the first jet, the experiment, the Navy's first carrier jet. Underpowered and with short range, it nonetheless proved that jets could take off and land on a carrier deck safely. F-9F Panther, the Blue Tail, the movie star, the first Navy jet to see combat in Korea. It was rugged, reliable, and possessed a beautiful blue paint scheme. It famously crashed into a carrier ramp in the movie The Bridges at Tokori. F-2H Banshee, the Banjo, the high climber, capable of flying higher than early MiGs and carrying tactical nuclear weapons. It looked like a panther that had been hitting the gym. F-3D Skyknight, Willie the Whale, the night fighter, ugly and wide, with a cockpit so spacious pilots sat side by side. Its massive radar allowed it to kill enemies in total darkness, scoring the first jet versus jet night kill in history. F-7U Cutlass, the Gutless, a futuristic tailless design that flew like a brick. The engines were so weak pilots said the toaster in the galley put out more heat. It had a dangerously high crash rate and killed many pilots. F4D Skyray, the Ford, the Interceptor. Shaped like a manta ray, it climbed like a rocket. It was designed to launch from a deck and shoot down Soviet bombers before they reached the fleet. It held the world speed record in 1953. A-1 Skyraider, the SPAD, the Anomaly, piston engine plane in the jet age. It stayed in service through Vietnam because no jet could fly as slow and low to support ground troops. Could carry anything: bombs, napalm, and even a kitchen sink. A-3 Skywarrior, the Whale, the nuclear bomber, the heaviest aircraft ever regularly operated from a carrier. It was so big it didn't have ejection seats. Pilots darkly joked A-3D stood for all three dead. A-4 Skyhawk, the Scooter, Heinemann's hot rod, tiny delta-wing jet. Small, simple, and agile. It was so nimble it became the favorite aircraft of the Blue Angels for decades. F-8 Crusader, the last gunfighter, the MiG Master, the last Navy fighter designed with guns as the primary weapon. It had a variable incidence wing that tilted up for landing. Pilots loved it, maintenance crews hated it. F-4 Phantom II, the Brick, the triumph of thrust. Ugly, massive, and smoky, but the undisputed king of Vietnam. It set 16 world speed records and proved that, with enough power, even a brick can fly. A-6 Intruder, the Iron Tadpole, the Night Stalker, an ugly subsonic bomber with a massive radar nose. It flew dangerously low in pitch-black darkness and typhoons to drop bombs with computer-guided precision. A-7 Corsair II, the SLUF, short, little, ugly fucker, the efficient worker. It wasn't fast, but it had incredible range and introduced the first modern heads-up display, making bombing accurate and safe. A-5 Vigilante, the Beauty, the most aerodynamic bomber ever built. Designed to drop nukes from a tunnel between the engines, it became the fleet's fastest spy plane, dashing over targets at Mach 2 to take photos. F-111B, the Sea Aardvark, the Failure. The Navy refused to fly this heavy Air Force plane. It was too heavy for carriers and couldn't dogfight. Killing this program led directly to the creation of the F-14 Tomcat. Next is the transports and electronic warfare, the support cast. Our 4D Skytrain, the Goonie Bird, the Navy's version of the C-47 DC-3. It hauled cargo to every corner of the globe during World War II and beyond, famously landing on ice in Antarctica. Our 5D Skymaster, the Heavy Hauler, the 4-engine transport, DC-4, that carried heavy equipment and personnel across the Pacific. It was the backbone of naval logistics before the jet age. Grumman TF-1 Trader, the Mailman, a twin-engine piston transport designed specifically to land on carriers. It brought the mail, the money, the delivery truck, the trader's replacement, a turboprop that slams onto the deck to deliver high-priority parts and VIPs. It is the only way to get a package to a carrier in the middle of the ocean. C-2 Greyhound, the delivery truck, the trader's replacement, a turboprop that slams onto the deck to deliver high-priority parts and VIPs. It is the only way to get a package to a carrier in the middle of the ocean. E-1 Tracer, the Stuff with a Roof, the first carrier-based airborne early warning aircraft. It carried a massive radar radome above its fuselage, looking like an airplane wearing a hat. E-2 Hawkeye, the Hummer, the eye in the sky, recognizable by the giant rotating radar on its back. The carrier fleet is blind without it, coordinating battles from hundreds of miles away. Lockheed WV-2 Warning Star, the Connie, a massive 4-engine airliner, Constellation, modified with giant radars on the top and bottom. It patrolled the oceans during the Cold War to detect Soviet bombers approaching America. E-6 Mercury Takamo, take charge and move out, a white Boeing 707 designed for the apocalypse. It trails a 5-mile-long wire antenna to communicate with nuclear ballistic missile submarines submerged deep in the ocean. Next is the Aggressors and Special Missions. F-16N Viper, the Bad Guy, bought specifically for Top Gun to simulate agile Soviet fighters. They were stripped-down hot rods flown so hard they eventually cracked from the stress of constant dogfighting. F-5 Tiger II, the MiG-28, the standard aggressor, small, smoky, and hard to see visually. It serves as the trusted sparring partner of the fleet, teaching new pilots how to survive a dogfight. T-2 Buckeye, the Tub, the jet trainer. For 50 years, every Navy jet pilot learned to fly in this chubby, forgiving twinjet. It was slow and stable, the perfect first jet. TA-4J Skyhawk, the teacher, the advanced trainer. If you could land this nimble jet on a ship, you were ready for a fighter. It was the final test for student naval aviators. T-45 Goshawk, the Dolphin, the current carrier trainer, a modified British Hawk jet that teaches modern students how to hook a wire and handle a glass cockpit. T-28 Trojan, the Beast, a massive piston engine trainer used in the 50s. It was fast, loud, and later used as a ground attack plane in Vietnam by the CIA and Special Forces. T-34 Mentor, the primary, the simple propeller plane that started thousands of careers. It was the first plane a student pilot would ever fly. Next is the rotary wings, the helicopters. H-13 Sioux, the Bubble, the MASH helicopter, small, fragile, and used for training and light observation. It had no skin, just a bubble cockpit and a tail boom. H-19 Chickasaw, the Hopper, one of the first transport helicopters. It looked like a hunchback with the engine in the nose, but it saved thousands of lives in Korea evacuating the wounded. H-34 Seabat, the Radial, the ugly but reliable anti-sub hunter. With a massive radial engine in the nose, it was the backbone of the early Cold War fleet, hunting submarines with dipping sonar. H-2 Sea Sprite, the Lamp, the destroyer's friend, a small helicopter that lived on the back of frigates. It extended the ship's radar range and carried torpedoes to attack subs over the horizon. H-3 Sea King, the Dipper, the amphibian, famous for picking up Apollo astronauts. It had a boat hull fuselage allowing it to land on water, and it served as the president's Marine One for decades. CH-46 Sea Knight, the Frog, the tandem rotor supply bus. It flies with its tail low, looking like a sitting frog. It was the primary method for moving bombs, missiles, and food between ships during vertical replenishment. CH-53 Sea Stallion, the Heavy, the Giant, the largest helicopter in the Western world for decades. The Navy used it for heavy lifting and towing massive minesweeping sleds through the ocean. QH-50 the Drone, a forgotten 1960s experiment. A small unmanned helicopter carrying torpedoes launched from destroyers. It crashed often, but it predicted the future of drone warfare. SH-60 Seahawk, the Standard, the Swiss Army knife. Based on the Army's Black Hawk, it is navalized to resist salt corrosion. It hunts subs, rescues pilots, and fires missiles. The current backbone of the fleet. Finally, the modern era and the future, the high-tech fleet. F-14 Tomcat, the Defender, the Swing Wing King, the star of Top Gun, built to kill Soviet bombers with massive Phoenix missiles. It was big, fast, and the coolest plane on the deck. F/A-18 Hornet, the Bug, the replacement for everything, reliable, digital, and capable of both bombing and dogfighting. It brought the Navy into the modern digital age. F/A-18E/F Super Hornet, the Rhino, the bigger, badder Hornet, a completely new aircraft that carries more fuel and weapons. It is the current workhorse carrying the weight of the air wing. EA-18G Growler, the electronic warrior. It shoots electrons to blind enemy radar. It can shut down an entire enemy air defense network without firing a single bullet. S-3 Viking, the Hoover, the sub-hunter turned tanker, named for the vacuum cleaner sound of its engines. It patrolled the fleet perimeter for decades before being retired. P-3 Orion, the Legend, the long-range sub-hunter, a modified airliner that served for 50 years, tracking Soviet subs during the height of the Cold War. P-8 Poseidon, the New Era, the 737 Hunter. It flies higher and faster to scan the oceans with advanced acoustics, carries torpedoes and cruise missiles. V-22 Osprey, the hybrid, part plane, part helicopter. It brings heavy cargo to the fleet without a runway, linking the carrier strike group like never before. F-35C Lightning II, the Panther, the stealth computer, the Navy's first fifth-generation fighter. It gathers information and kills enemies before they even know they are being tracked. MQ-25 Stingray, the drone tanker, the future, an unmanned refueling aircraft that will extend the reach of the fighters, keeping human pilots out of danger. X-47B, the robot, the prototype, a tailless, pilotless batwing that proved a robot could take off and land on a moving carrier autonomously.